In the autumn of 1944, as the Allied advance in Western Europe pressed deeper toward Germany, the front entered a phase where momentum collided with exhaustion. What had once been a rapid pursuit after the breakout from Normandy had slowed into grinding pressure, marked by stubborn resistance and mounting casualties. Roads were crowded with supply columns struggling to keep pace. Infantry units rotated through near-constant combat, and armored formations faced terrain that increasingly favored defense. It was during this difficult transition that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and U.S. First Army Commander Courtney Hodges confronted a shared dilemma: whether to ease the pressure on their exhausted forces or continue driving the enemy without pause. Both men understood that slowing the front might offer temporary relief, but it also risked allowing German forces the time they desperately needed to recover. Montgomery believed that the enemy was already near his breaking point. German units along the Western Front were depleted, poorly supplied, and increasingly reliant on improvised defensive positions. Every pause, Montgomery argued, gave them a chance to reorganize, shorten their lines, and restore discipline. Hodges, commanding American forces engaged in some of the heaviest fighting, shared the concern. His army was stretched thin, facing fortified towns, rivers, and entrenched German formations that resisted fiercely. Yet Hodges also saw that German resistance, while stubborn, lacked depth. It was holding because it had to, not because it could sustain prolonged defense. To ease pressure now, Hodges feared, would transform fragile resistance into something more durable. The conditions along the front reinforced their assessment. German forces were fighting a delaying campaign, trading ground for time while seeking defensible terrain. Rivers such as the Meuse and the Roer offered natural barriers, while urban centers became strong points designed to bleed advancing Allied units. Montgomery viewed this as confirmation that relentless pressure was essential. The enemy was not maneuvering freely, he was reacting. Hodges observed similar patterns within his sector. German counterattacks were localized and short-lived, designed to disrupt rather than reverse the Allied advance. These actions signaled strain rather than strength. For both commanders, the conclusion was the same: the front could not be allowed to settle. Yet the cost of continuing was undeniable. Allied units were exhausted, logistics were stretched, and replacement troops often arrived with limited combat experience. Hodges faced the challenge of sustaining offensive operations while preserving the cohesion of his forces. Montgomery faced the broader task of coordinating pressure across multiple Allied armies, ensuring that no sector slackened enough to give the enemy breathing space. Their resolve was not driven by optimism, but by calculation. They believed that the German army was absorbing pressure it could not fully withstand. The decision to refuse a slowdown was therefore not an act of impatience, but a strategic judgment. Montgomery and Hodges understood that the war in the West was entering a decisive phase. The enemy's resources were dwindling, his options narrowing. What remained uncertain was whether Allied pressure could be sustained long enough to force collapse rather than stabilization. Slowing the front might ease Allied strain, but it would also reduce the cumulative weight pressing down on German defenses. As orders went out emphasizing continued pressure, the character of the campaign hardened. Advances were measured in yards rather than miles, but they continued nonetheless. Montgomery's insistence on constant engagement and Hodges' determination to keep American forces moving reflected a shared belief. Victory would not come from a single breakthrough, but from unrelenting strain applied across the entire front. The enemy would not break all at once. He would be worn down, position by position, unit by unit. To stop pushing now would risk losing that fragile advantage. As the decision to keep pushing took hold, the reality of refusing to slow the front became increasingly harsh. Allied units advanced not into open ground, but into prepared defenses where every gain had to be earned under fire. German forces exploited terrain relentlessly, anchoring their resistance in villages, forests, and river lines that forced costly frontal assaults. Montgomery observed that the enemy was no longer attempting to maneuver, but to endure. That endurance, however, depended entirely on time. every hour the Allies maintained pressure reduced German ability to rotate units, resupply ammunition, or reinforce weak points. Hodges saw the same dynamic unfold across his sector. His troops faced fierce resistance, but German counterattacks lacked coordination and depth. They struck hard, then faded, leaving behind signs of exhaustion rather than renewed strength. The strain on Allied forces was unmistakable. Casualties mounted, morale fluctuated, and logistics officers struggled to keep ammunition and fuel flowing to forward units. Hodges faced difficult choices daily, deciding when to commit reserves and when to accept temporary pauses without signaling a broader slowdown. Montgomery, coordinating pressure across multiple armies, emphasized continuity. Even limited advances mattered if they denied the enemy a moment of recovery. Both commanders accepted that the cost of maintaining momentum would be high. What concerned them more was the alternative. A deliberate pause might allow German forces to consolidate behind stronger defensive lines, transforming exhaustion into resilience. German behavior reinforced their judgment. Intelligence reports indicated that German units were being thrown into battle as soon as they arrived, often without full equipment or rest. Defensive lines were thin, relying on improvisation rather than depth. Montgomery interpreted this as a sign that German command was fighting a losing battle against time. Hodges noted that while resistance was fierce, it was reactive. German forces were responding to Allied moves rather than shaping events themselves. This imbalance, subtle but significant, convinced both men that pressure must be sustained even when progress seemed painfully slow. At the same time, Eisenhower's broader strategic guidance provided a framework for their resolve. The objective was not speed for its own sake, but attrition imposed under unfavorable conditions for the enemy. Montgomery and Hodges translated this into relentless local pressure. Attacks were limited in scope, carefully coordinated, and immediately followed by renewed engagement. There would be no long pauses to reorganize unless absolutely necessary. Hodges ensured that American units rotated where possible, maintaining combat effectiveness without signaling a halt. Montgomery focused on synchronization, ensuring that pressure in one sector complemented advances in another. By late autumn, the effects of this approach became increasingly visible. German units showed signs of cumulative fatigue. Defensive positions were held stubbornly, then abandoned abruptly when pressure became unbearable. Montgomery recognized this pattern as the precursor to collapse. Hodges, cautious by nature, remained focused on sustaining Allied strength while exploiting German weakness. Their refusal to slow the front did not produce dramatic breakthroughs, but it eroded the enemy's ability to resist in a controlled, predictable manner. The cost of this strategy was paid daily by Allied soldiers, a fact neither commander ignored. Yet both understood that war rarely offered humane alternatives. To ease pressure now would prolong fighting later, under potentially worse conditions. Montgomery and Hodges accepted responsibility for that calculation. The front would continue to move, however slowly, denying the enemy rest and forcing him to fight continuously. By maintaining pressure when exhaustion tempted caution, Montgomery and Hodges shaped the campaign's trajectory. They ensured that German forces never fully recovered from the retreat that had brought them to this line. The front did not break suddenly, but it weakened steadily. Refusing to slow the advance was not about impatience. It was about recognizing that the enemy's greatest ally was time, and denying him that ally, regardless of the cost. As the pressure continued into early winter, the consequences of refusing to slow the front became clearer on both sides of the line. German defenses, though still dangerous, began to show signs of cumulative strain. Units that had held villages or ridgelines for days suddenly withdrew overnight, not because they had been decisively defeated, but because they could no longer sustain the effort. Ammunition shortages, lack of reserves, and constant Allied probing eroded their ability to respond coherently. Montgomery observed that German resistance was becoming brittle. It still fought fiercely at the point of contact, but it lacked elasticity. Once pressure reached a certain threshold, positions collapsed quickly. Hodges saw the same pattern emerge across his army's sector. The enemy could delay, but not recover. Each engagement weakened German forces in ways that could not be repaired. For the Allied troops, the grind was relentless. Advances were measured in yards, often gained at significant cost. Hodges faced the daily challenge of balancing offensive pressure with the physical limits of his units. Rest was scarce, replacements were inexperienced, and leadership at the company and battalion level bore the weight of constant combat. Yet the refusal to slow the front created a psychological advantage. German units were denied predictability. They could not count on pauses to regroup or rebuild morale. Montgomery believed this uncertainty was as damaging as material losses. An enemy forced to react continuously loses the ability to shape events. Even when Allied attacks were limited, their persistence communicated a clear message: there would be no respite. Strategically, the effects extended beyond immediate tactical gains. German command was forced into a defensive posture defined by urgency rather than planning. Reserves were committed piecemeal, often too late to stabilize collapsing sectors. Hodges' intelligence officers reported that German units were being rushed into battle with minimal preparation, a sign that higher command was struggling to manage the tempo imposed upon it. Montgomery interpreted this as confirmation that the front was being compressed faster than the enemy could adapt. The refusal to slow the advance had turned time into a weapon. The pressure also tested Allied coordination. Sustaining continuous engagement required precise timing between adjacent formations to prevent gaps from opening. Hodges emphasized communication and mutual support, ensuring that progress in one area did not expose another to counterattack. Montgomery reinforced this approach at the operational level, pressing for alignment across the front. Neither man underestimated the risk of overextension, but both believed that controlled pressure, even when slow, was preferable to deliberate pauses that would benefit the enemy. As winter weather worsened conditions, the temptation to ease operations grew stronger. Mud, cold, and fatigue slowed movement and magnified every logistical challenge. Hodges acknowledged that circumstances would eventually force adjustments. Montgomery accepted that reality as well, but adjustment did not mean relief for the enemy. The guiding principle remained unchanged. Pressure must be maintained wherever possible. Even limited attacks served a purpose if they denied German forces the opportunity to reset. By this stage of the campaign, the cumulative impact of unrelenting pressure was unmistakable. German defensive lines were thinner, less coordinated, and increasingly dependent on desperation rather than discipline. Montgomery recognized that the enemy was being worn down rather than defeated outright. Hodges viewed this attrition as the necessary price of progress. Neither expected a sudden collapse. What they anticipated was something slower but just as decisive, a steady erosion of the enemy's capacity to resist. Refusing to slow the front did not promise dramatic victories or clean breakthroughs. It promised something more subtle and more dangerous for the enemy. It promised exhaustion without recovery. Montgomery and Hodges understood that wars are often decided not by singular moments, but by sustained pressure applied at the right time. As winter tightened its grip, the front continued to move, slowly, painfully, but inexorably, carrying with it the consequences of a decision made when slowing down had seemed the easier choice. By the time the campaign moved deeper into winter, the long-term consequences of Montgomery and Hodges' refusal to slow the front were unmistakable. German forces along the Western Front were no longer capable of sustained resistance across broad sectors. Instead, they clung to isolated strongpoints, defending only what they absolutely had to, while abandoning ground whenever pressure became unbearable. Montgomery saw this as confirmation that the enemy's defensive system had fractured under constant strain. There was no longer a coherent line, only a series of fragile holds. Hodges observed that German units were increasingly reactive, committing reserves locally and too late. The front had not broken in a single dramatic moment, but it had weakened steadily, exactly as both commanders had anticipated. For Allied forces, the cost of this approach was heavy but purposeful. Casualties accumulated, equipment wore down, and fatigue became a constant companion. Hodges worked to preserve the fighting effectiveness of his army, rotating units where possible and ensuring that pressure never lapsed entirely. Montgomery coordinated across Allied formations to maintain continuity, understanding that even small pauses could give the enemy precious time. Both men accepted that the campaign would be slower and bloodier than the rapid pursuit that preceded it. Yet they also understood that allowing the front to settle into inactivity would have prolonged the war and strengthened German resistance in the long run. The enemy's response reflected desperation rather than control. German counterattacks grew increasingly local and improvised, often relying on depleted units and limited artillery support. Intelligence reports revealed mounting shortages of fuel, ammunition, and experienced leadership. Montgomery recognized that German command was being forced to fight without flexibility. Hodges noted that while German soldiers continued to fight hard, their ability to coordinate large-scale defensive efforts had eroded. The refusal to slow the front had denied the enemy the time required to rebuild coherence. As the war progressed, this cumulative pressure shaped the conditions for the final phase of the campaign. German forces entered subsequent battles weakened, overstretched, and psychologically drained. Montgomery believed that without the sustained pressure applied during this period, later operations would have faced a far stronger and more organized opponent. Hodges shared this view, seeing the relentless advance as a necessary investment. The price was paid gradually, but the return was decisive. Looking back, the decision to push until the enemy broke was not a matter of aggressiveness alone. It was an understanding of how modern war exhausted armies as much through time as through firepower. Montgomery's insistence on constant engagement and Hodges' determination to keep American forces moving created a tempo the German army could not match. The front was denied stability, and without stability, resistance could not recover. The refusal to slow the front stands as a defining example of how pressure, rather than speed or maneuver alone, can decide a campaign. Montgomery and Hodges did not seek dramatic breakthroughs. They sought to deny the enemy recovery. In doing so, they ensured that German forces were worn down continuously, unable to regain the initiative or restore confidence. The front moved forward not because it surged, but because it never stopped. In the end, the enemy did break, not in a single collapse, but through accumulated exhaustion. The campaign validated the judgment that slowing down would have been the greater risk. Montgomery and Hodges accepted the cost of sustained pressure and turned it into strategic advantage. By refusing to give the enemy time, they shaped the conditions that made final victory in Western Europe inevitable.